All right, so we're going to dive into chapter 5 here, which really is the first of many organ systems that we're going to learn about in A and P. So this is the integumentary system, having to do with, the branch of dermatology, the hair, the skin, and the nails, mainly the skin here we're going to learn about. I thought it was interesting, the root of the word integument is this word tegere here, which means to cover. So it makes sense because the skin covers the body, right? We're talking about what's on that, the outside of the body. All right, so, I wrote here, we're starting to learn like real doctor stuff here. So it's, pretty exciting. So the skin makes up about 16% of our body weight. That's pretty crazy. And we have two main parts. We have the cutaneous membrane, which is made up of the epidermis, which is that superficial part, the part we can see, and then the dermis, which is that underlying area of connective tissue. And then not technically part of that, but below that, inferior to that, would be the subcutaneous layer, or also the hypodermis, of like below dermis. And that separates the skin from what's called the deep fascia. All right. Then we also have accessory structures, which we'll learn about. So hair follicles, exocrine glands, not to be confused with endocrine glands, and nails. So the main functions of the integumentary system: protection, excretion of salts, water, and waste. So think about when you sweat, maintenance of our body temperature through insulation or evaporative cooling, again through sweat, production of melanin, production of keratin, synthesis of vitamin D, lipid storage in adipocytes, detection via pressure, touch, pain, vibration, and temperature, and immune response. So a lot. Our skin does a lot, not just the skin, the entire system here. So here's just a breakdown of that. We have the epidermis, which protects the dermis. It prevents water loss. So you think of all the water and fluid in your body. Epidermis is going to keep that trapped in, so it just all doesn't leak out. Synthesizes vitamin D3, and you have those sensory receptors. That's why we feel pain. That's why our body changes, via homeostasis to temperature. The dermis underneath that nourishes and supports the epidermis. There's a reticular layer, part of that. That's what has those sensory receptors. And then the accessory structures: hair, which protects the skull, which is pretty interesting, provides some touch sensations, our exocrine glands, and our nails. So we'll get into more detail on those. So we're going to start with the epidermis. The type of cells that we're talking about here is the stratified squamous epithelium. So that means multiple layer. That's where that stratified comes into play. And squamous means flat cells. All right, so the epidermis is just this top section here, just this kind of tan section with the kind of purple underneath. If I can make this. All right, and you can see hair shafts here. These are the accessory structures. You could see pores of sweat glands. You can see what are called sebaceous glands. You could see this erector pili muscle, which I believe makes hair stand up straight. You can see the ducts of these sweat glands that go down to these little knots called the sweat glands themselves. And these are the ducts. You have these corpuscles, and then you have nerve fibers also. The dermis here, you can see, is much, much thicker. It's probably, I don't know, maybe 6 or 7 times thicker. You have the papillary layer, which is the one that touches that basement membrane of the epidermis, and you have the reticular layer. And of course, you have the subcutaneous layer down here. You could see these adipocytes here with fat, and then you can see the blood supply, the main blood supply, the arteries and the veins are located at the very bottom of the dermis layer and at the kind of superior end of the subcutaneous layer. So relatively very deep in our skin. All right, and then you have this kind of like sub blood section here that does reach the top. So it's going to be able to provide nutrients to the epidermis. It's called the subpapillary plexus. So the interesting thing, the epidermis itself is avascular, right? There are no blood vessels in this section itself. We have something called keratinocytes or keratinocytes, probably keratinocytes, body's most abundant of the epithelial cells. They're named because they contain a large amount of keratin. So keratin, we have two, it's a protein. We have two alpha helical polypeptides, so protein. They're wound together like the strands of a rope. Keratin is tough, it's water resistant. It's found in the nails and the hair. All right, you hear about like keratin treatments for hair. It's tough, fibrous, and found in skin, hair, and nails. The epidermis can actually be thin or thick. The thin skin has 4 layers of these keratinocytes. Let's see if I can get the pronunciation for that. Keratinocytes. All right, I wouldn't have.
Keratinocyte.
All right, so there's 2 different ones. Keratinocyte, keratinocyte. Keratinocyte kind of sounds a little better. That thin skin of the epidermis, it's found. We'll actually find out where it's found. The thick has 5 layers, so 1 extra layer. It's found in the palms and soles of your feet, and that's it. So thick skin on the palms and soles of your feet, thin skin everywhere else. Now, even though the epidermis, relatively to this whole chunk of, skin, integument, it actually has all of these layers. Okay, thick skin has that 5th layer, which is called the stratum lucidum here, but the surface, so if you want to get really specific, when people say your epidermis is showing, well, it's actually your stratum corneum, multiple layers of actually flattened, dead keratinocytes. So the dead skin that you see on the outside, they're water resistant, but not waterproof. Okay. And it's actually very thick. You can see the stratum corneum is like, I don't know, 75% of our epidermis. Inferior to that, we have the stratum lucidum. It's a glassy layer. It's in thick skin only. So that is that part that is only in thick skin, very small. Stratum granulosum. That's where the keratinocytes produce keratin. The stratum spinosum. That's where we have desmosomes. So you think of those gap junctions between cells that prevent fluid loss. And then we have that basal layer at the base, which attaches to the basement membrane, which then will attach to the dermis. Okay. So yeah, it's cool. You have these like little mountains as you lift up the epidermis. You have what's called the dermal papilla. So it's these little mountains of the dermis that interlocked into the basement membrane of this kind of epidermal ridge. All right, so the stratum basale, we're going to start at the most inferior part. That's base or basement. It has hemidesmosomes that attach this layer to the basement membrane, which is the dermis. We have the epidermal ridges meeting the dermal papillae, so these mountains. All right. So if we want to do like a real quick desmosome refresher, most epithelial cells are subject to mechanical stresses like stretching, bending, twisting, or compression. You can think of that. Squeeze your hand. At a desmosome, I don't know what a CAM is, but these proteoglycans link the opposing plasma membranes. It's a cell adhesion molecule. Typical desmosome is formed of components from 2 cells. So it's these purple kind of holes here. Connection to cytoskeleton gives the desmosome and the epithelium its strength. They're very strong and they resist that stretching and twisting. So they kind of hold cells together. And it anchors underlying tissues. So in the stratum basale, we have basal cells. These are stem cells that divide to replace the more superficial keratinocytes that are then shed to the epithelial surface. So they start at the base and they kind of move their way upwards, and then they die and they sit at the superior surface of the skin, and then they shed. We shed skin cells like crazy. Skin surfaces that lack hair contain a special sensor cell called a tactile or Merkel cell. So areas that don't have hair, if you flip your hand to the anatomical position, look at the anterior of your forearm there, there's areas that don't have hair. It's the bottom of the epidermis, but still technically still very high up in the skin itself. Because if we look at this image here, we're still talking about the epidermis, which is very, very superior when we're talking about the integument. There's also pigment cells in the stratum basale that are called melanocytes, which give skin its brown tone. Okay. And we'll talk about how the sun can affect melanocytes and the tone of our skin. So next up, superiorly, we have the, I say after the basement are the stairs, so the stratum spinosum, so S spinosum. It says about 8 to 10 layers of keratinocytes, and they're bound together by those desmosomes. The spinosum means spiny layer. We have some immune cells there also. After you get up from the stairs, you're in the kitchen where your grandmother is. So G for granny, granulosum. We have 3 to 5 layers of keratinocytes. This is where they've now actually stopped dividing, and they're now doing their job. They're producing that keratin, which we were talking about, is that tough fibrous protein. All right, this is where they're going to start becoming thinner and flatter. The stratum lucidum, they're only found in the palms and the feet. All right, so working up finally to the stratum corneum, which is the most superior of the epidermis. This is a big boy. It has 15 to 30 layers of keratinized cells. The term keratinization is the formation of protective superficial layers of cells filled with keratin. All right, the dead cells in each layer of the stratum corneum remain tightly interconnected by desmosomes. The connections are so secure that keratinized cells are generally shed in large groups or sheets rather than individually. This is why we peel after sunburn, because the cells are sticking together. That's desmosomes at work. Every minute, we shed about 30,000 to 40,000 skin cells, and that adds up to about 9 pounds of skin cells every year. So we're losing 9 pounds every year just for free. All right. It takes 7 to 10 days for a cell to move from that stratum basale to the stratum corneum. The dead cells generally remain in the exposed stratum corneum for an additional 2 weeks before they are shed or washed away. So those 30,000 to 40,000 skin cells that we're losing have been there for about 2 weeks. That's pretty amazing. So the surface is usually dry, making it unsuitable for growth of microorganisms. So you can think that's a very important function of our integument. It's going to prevent just random bacteria from just growing on your skin because it's so dry. We also have this hydrophobic lipid secretion, which is preventing water loss or gain. Very cool. The stratum corneum is also water resistant, but not waterproof. So water from that interstitial fluid does slowly diffuse onto the surface and evaporate. We lose about 500 milliliters of water each day through that process. This is called insensible perspiration because you can't see or feel this. So you're always slowly sweating, even when you're just sitting or sleeping or whatever. All right. Now we are aware of what's called sensible perspiration, which is produced by sweat glands, which we'll get. All right. Epidermal growth factor is a thing. We won't get into that. So that's the epidermis. All right. Now we're going to move on to the dermis, which is this tissue layer that supports the epidermis. All right. So we're going to zoom in a little bit here to the dermis, which is this whole section here. You could see again those mountainous papillae where they meet those epidermal ridges. Now, the dermis itself is two layers. We have a superficial papillary layer where we have some areolar tissue. And if you remember from our tissue chapter, areolar tissue is that padding and blood supply. It's a very good place to inject medicine into because of that blood supply. We also have lymphatic vessels and sensory nervous fibers. Excuse me. When we talk about dermatitis, it's the papillary layer that's affected. Dermatitis, an example could be eczema or just general kind of skin irritation. So this is not actually happening on the epidermal kind of surface layer. This is actually happening just inferior to that. So we have this deeper reticular fiber, which is below this subpapillary plexus of blood vessels. This is where we have these woven fibers. And now, so we were talking about keratin, now enter collagen. Collagen fibers are very strong and resist stretching, but they can be bent or twisted. Think like a splint material. When you splint, you're not going to be able to bend this way, but you can bend it this way very easily. All right, elastic fibers provide the flexibility while collagen prevents the damage. It's a very cool relationship here. And if we go back to when we were first introduced to collagen in our tissue layer, that collagen are like strands of rope. So yeah, you can bend it this way, but it's stronger than steel when pulled from either end. So this is also where we have that skin turgor in terms of signs of dehydration. And dehydrated dermis will remain peaked when pinched, dehydrated, but hydrated skin will flatten out. So, so dehydration, if you pull the skin up, it's going to kind of stay that way. Aging, hormones, and UV light will permanently reduce the amount of elastin in the dermis. That's where we get wrinkles and the sagging of skin, okay? Here's a close-up of the reticular layer of dermis. So again, that kind of tightly woven fibers, and it looks like a blanket or a sweater. You can have the collagen, which is going to provide that strength and resist stretching in a certain way, but it can still be bent and twisted. And then we have the elastic fibers, which provide that flexibility. Very cool relationship here with the collagen preventing damage. Very quick refresher of the three types of connective tissue fiber, because that's what we're talking about here. Collagen, which is the most common. Again, again, stronger than steel. Tendons are an example of this, which connect muscle to bone. Ligaments, of course. Reticular fibers, they stabilize the position of blood cells. You can see, of blood vessels. We can see blood vessels in that reticular layer here, so it makes sense. And this stops your insides from moving around when you change positions. Elastic fibers contain the protein elastin. After being stretched, they return to their original position, like when you pull on your skin. All right. Pregnancy and weight loss can actually exceed the elastic limits of the skin. It can't recoil back to its original size. This causes wrinkles or creases called stretch marks. So when you gain weight and your skin stretches and stretches and stretches, and then you lose that weight, that's where you're going to get those stretch marks. The fibers of the skin are in bundles called tension lines, and it's literally like the grain of a tree. And when you make incisions, so when you think about surgery, or when you think about, if you have a cut and you're trying to suture that together, you want to go with the grain because it will heal with little scarring. So if you get cut on your body, you want to hope that it's along a tension line. Obviously, we're not so lucky in that regard. All right, so let's talk about, I've mentioned it a couple of times, this subpapillary plexus. It's a network of blood vessels. So it's the arteries that are supplying the skin. They are deep in the subcutaneous layer. Well, there's kind of two. There's a cutaneous plexus and there's a subpapillary plexus. So the cutaneous plexus is the one that's deep in that subcutaneous layer, which again isn't technically part of the cutaneous membrane, the epidermis or the dermis. It's below that. Trauma to the skin often causes a contusion. I think of conbrusion because it's a bruise, which causes ecchymosis, which is a pooling of blood. That makes blood leak from that sub-Q layer up to the dermal layer, and it kind of gets trapped in there. All right. All right, so we're going to talk about that subcutaneous layer. Remember, the hypodermis is what we're talking about. It's that subcutaneous layer, and there is a distinct barrier between it and the dermis, namely the inferior reticular layer. So this big, thick boy here. It has adipose tissue and areolar tissue with adipocytes. The subcutaneous fat makes up about 80% of all body fat. Pretty crazy. The remaining is what's called visceral fat, which I believe surrounds our visceral organs. This region has a ton of blood, and this is why the skin is sometimes called a blood reservoir. I had never heard of that. That's pretty wild. It has a limited number of capillaries and no vital organs, making it a useful place to put drugs. The subcutaneous layer is where we get more fat during puberty in our breasts and our hips, etc. So when you think about 80 milligrams of X sub-Q, that's where we're putting this medicine because it's filled with blood vessels. All right, let's talk a bit about pigmentation and dermal circulation. So there are two pigments, actually. There's melanin and there's carotene. So I've heard a lot about beta carotene, which gives yellow, orange, and red coloring to vegetables. We convert that into vitamin A, also called retinol. Interesting. Okay. So melanin is a primary determinant, and it's produced by melanocytes, which we could see here at the basement membrane of the, if this is the dermis, then this is the epidermis. And that's the pigment producing cells, melanocytes, okay? There are two forms. There is pheomelanin, which creates red and yellow, and eumelanin, which creates brown and black. So melanocytes create melanin, which is one of the pigments of the epidermis. These are in the stratum basale. So yeah, the part that touches the dermis. We have tyrosine, which is an amino acid, which is pretty cool. And the melanocytes, they package the melanin into melanosomes. And those are these little vesicles here that are going kind of traveling upwards, I believe. Send it superiorly towards the surface. It happens in the stratum basale and spinosum, which is that basement stairs. That's the next part. Superiorly, and the cells lose their pigmentation. All right, so we have darker skin underneath. The melanosomes are larger and more numerous, and the transfer may occur in the stratum granulosum, which is up from the spinosum, making our skin darker. In albinism, these melanocytes simply don't produce that melanin. All right, freckles are areas where the melanocytes are producing larger than average amounts of melanin. So it's going to create those darker spots on our skin. They're more abundant in the face due to the exposure of the sun. So enter ultraviolet radiation. How does the sun tan our skin? Well, the melanin and these keratinocytes, and you can see here the keratinocytes, and you can see these melanosomes containing melanin inside of them. They protect our epidermis and dermis from the sun. So UV increases the production of melanin. Excuse my language here. UV also stimulates calcium ion homeostasis, a big signaling molecule. You have too much UV and it can damage the DNA and cause mutations causing cancer. Dark skin means more melanin, which is actually a natural sun protection. So you can think of one of the functions of melanin is that it protects us from the sun. Too much UV And the fibroblasts, those fiber builders, which we learned about in the tissue chapter, are damaged and wrinkles can form. So what about that other pigment, carotene? So carotene, which is that orange yellow pigment, and yes, eating carrots can turn pale skin orange. Vitamin A is involved here. So we were talking about that beta carotene that is found in vegetables like carrots, and our body converts that into vitamin A called retinol. All right, so hemoglobin is also a pigment, and when bound to oxygen, it's bright red. When our skin becomes flushed, when our body temperature rises, or in response to the inflammation response, the blood vessels dilate to get blood closer to that skin. So all of those immune response cells can leak out and help out and clot and eat pathogens. That's why we get red in the face. When we are frightened, blood is shunted to the core. Oh, I'm sorry. Blood is shunted to the core and we turn pale. When we get embarrassed, blood is shunted to the face. I should read about that. So yeah, when we turn pale, blood is going to the core, into our vital organs here. So that's why our face is getting pale. When circulation is reduced, hemoglobin turns very dark red, which from the outside looks blue and causes cyanosis. Jaundice is where the liver is unable to excrete bile and bilirubin accumulates. So the reason we get that yellow in the eyes or in the skin is because of bilirubin, which is a yellow pigment. In vitiligo, which is that patchy face skin, which we can see on the right here, we've seen about 1% of the populations, melanocytes are just lost completely in those areas. So you think of the melanin creating that browner skin, they're just not here at all in the paleness. Yeah, and albinism melanocytes, they just don't produce that melanin. So let's talk about, why does our face turn red? Well, let's make a hypothesis. Why do we think our face would look red when we are embarrassed? So obviously, if it's turning red, we're going to have maybe some pheomelanin in there. We're probably going to have some hemoglobin. So why would blood rush to our face? Why would hemoglobin kind of rush to the surface of our skin? I'm not sure. Why would we need more blood to our skin? Maybe we want it in our brain. Maybe we want our senses heightened. We're talking about vasodilation. We're talking about increasing our temperature, getting warm. Let's find out. Why does our face turn red? Skin flushing as a result of increased blood flow. When embarrassed. Here we go, the science of blushing. Part of the fight or flight mechanism. Your pupils dilate to get in more light. So yeah, we need our senses heightened. As blood rushes to your face, there is a noticeable effect in your appearance. Many psychologists believe that this suggests that blushing is a defense mechanism response we develop to help avoid a potential fight or flight confrontation. Oh, through a public display of your own discomfort, other people are able to recognize that you didn't intend to attack or offend them. That's crazy. Let's put that in here. And it likely comes from dogs, wolves. They lie on their bellies. Cats flatten their ears. They tuck their tails between their hind legs. So we all have this kind of physical representation of when we're kind of sorry. That is fascinating. And we're going to add that in here. Why do we get red in the face? Fascinating stuff. Hopefully you find that as interesting as I do. Okay, so now we're going to move on to sunlight a bit more. Sunlight causes epidermal cells to convert a steroid into vitamin D3. So we know that UV stimulates those calcium ions, which we talked a little bit about before. It's also going to stimulate cells in the stratum spinosum and basale, our basement and stairs, to convert a cholesterol lipid compound into cholecalciferol to vitamin D3. Why is that beneficial? Well, when the liver can convert that cholecalciferol, the kidneys can then make the hormone calcitriol, and that's very good for us. It helps us absorb calcium. This is important for our bones. Not enough of it leads to rickets or abnormal bone development. So we literally need sunlight to keep our bones strong. So get outside. Hair, now, one of these, we're talking about the accessory structures of the integument. It's made of keratinized dead cells pushed to the skin surface where it has protecting and insulating roles. All right, so again, enter those accessory structures we talked about. They're located in the dermis, but project to the surface through the epidermis. Our hair, the body has 2.5 million of them, and 75% are on the general body, not on the head. So even though we have all that hair on our head, 75% of it is elsewhere. They're non-living structures. Now, the hair on our head protects from UV light, helps cushion light impacts. It actually acts like a small helmet. That's crazy. And it also insulates the skull and keeps it warm. In the nose and the ears, as we can kind of surmise here, it keeps out foreign particles, insects. Eyelashes do that for the eyes, and eyebrows keep sweat out of the eyes. Not mine. When I'm really sweating, I get hair in my eyes all the time. So here's the structure of a hair. There's a medulla in the middle. It's the core, contains that flexible, soft keratin. We have the cortex, which contains thick layers of hard keratin. It gives hair that stiffness. We have then the cuticle, which is thin, tough, and contains hard keratin. Then we have the follicle, which is going to be the more outside part. There's an internal root sheath, external sheath, glassy membrane. It's thickened, clear layer, wrapped. Interesting. So here's the hair shaft going into the hair root. We have this connective tissue sheath that surrounds it and the root hair plexus. So it looks like there is a little blood flow into the bottom there. Base of the hair follicle is a root hair plexus, a network, okay, of sensory nerves. That's not a blood supply. This is why we can feel the movement of just one hair. It provides a warning so that maybe we can swat that bug before it bites us. There's a smooth muscle called the erector pili muscle, which we can see attaches to the connective tissue sheath of our hair follicle here, which makes our hair stand up, producing goosebumps. A state of the skin caused by cold, fear, excitement when small bumps appear on the surface as the hair becomes erect. So the hair is being pulled up a little bit, just creating those goosebumps. The hair that we see are called hair shafts. The hair itself has 3 layers, which we kind of already went through. At the very bottom of the hair follicle, we have something called a hair bulb, which is where hair production begins. The hair papilla and hair matrix produce basal cells, again, those skin stem cells that produce daughter cells that are gradually pushed to the surface. At the level that forms the visible hair shaft, the cells of the medulla, cortex, and cuticle are all dead, and the keratinization process is at its end. So very similar to that skin itself. Everything on the surface is dead. All right, a hair in the scalp grows for about 2 to 5 years. As hair grows, the hair root absorbs nutrients and incorporates them into the hair structure. This is why hair samples are a thing. At the end of a growth cycle, the follicle becomes inactive and the hair is called a club hair. The follicles get smaller and eventually the follicle produces a new hair and the old one is shed. So it's almost like another hair is coming from underneath. We lose about 100 head hairs each day, and more than that. When we lose more than 100 head hairs each day, it's called hair loss. Here's a question. Why does hair on the face, on the beard, keep growing, but hair on like the forearms and the eyebrows don't? So let's kind of find out. Why doesn't all of our hair grow? Why doesn't body hair grow long? The cells that make the hairs on your arms are programmed to stop growing every couple of months, so the hair on your arms stays short. I guess because we don't need to cushion the rest of our body from impacts, but up here and up here, we want to cushion from impacts. I guess that makes sense. Head hair continues to serve the greatest biological purpose. Now that we walk upright, protecting our extremities and trunks from direct sunlight isn't a huge concern, but our heads are still pretty vulnerable to the sun's rays. The growth cycle of hair on our body is a growth cycle of weeks, not years. Interesting. Talk about the anagen phase, catagen phase. All right, so kind of an answer there. All right, let's talk about sebaceous glands, which are sweat glands. They are exocrine glands found on the skin. All right, now we have 3 types of glands here. Well, hold on. Intersebaceous glands are oil glands, which are holocrine glands, a type of exocrine gland. All right, so the types of glands here have different types of secretion. We have merocrine secretion. This is a product that's released via secretory vesicles through exocytosis, so we can think sweat and saliva. We have apocrine secretion, this secretory product, as well as some cytoplasm, think milk from the mammary glands. So it's not just the secretion from the secretory vesicles, we're also getting some cytoplasm. Then there's holocrine secretions, which are pretty nuts. The entire gland cell is destroyed, a superficial cell in a stratified multiple layer glandular epithelium becomes packed with secretory vesicles and then bursts, releasing the secretion, but killing the cell in the process. Now, sebaceous glands produce sebum, which are lipids. This sebum is what inhibits the growth of bacteria, lubricates and protects our hair shaft, and conditions the skin. The dead keratinized cells become dry and brittle when exposed to the environment. This sebum is a natural conditioner. Our shampoo and conditioner actually remove these natural lipids and replace them. So that's pretty interesting. So we can see a sebaceous gland actually attached to a hair follicle and also a sebaceous gland by itself. The ones by themselves are found on the face, back, chest, nipples, and external genitalia. So face, back, chest, especially face and the back, is where we get a lot of acne. All right. Let's talk about sweat glands themselves. We have two types. There's apocrine sweat glands, which again, we have the secretory product and some cytoplasm. We'll find those in the armpits, nipples, pubic region, where they secrete their products into hair follicles. Sticky, cloudy, odorous, so armpits and pubic region. They're actually merocrine secretions, but the old name stuck. That's pretty dumb. Then we have eccrine sweat glands, also known as merocrine sweat glands. They're far more abundant. We have 2 to 5 million of them. They go directly to the skin. We'll find those in the palms and soles of the feet. So think about sweaty palms and sweaty feet. All right. The apocrine smelly ones are attached to hair. So it's easy to remember because armpits and the pubis area. The ecrines one goes straight to the surface without a hair follicle. So no hair on the palms of your hand or the soles of your feet. Well, now what does sweat do? It cools the surface of the skin. It excretes water and electrolytes, and it provides protection. So you can see all the different parts, the apocrine sweat glands, blah, blah, blah. Let's talk about nails. These are keratinized epidermal cells that produce the tips, protect the tips of the fingers and the toes. So just a quick recap of what keratin is. Tough water-resistant protein at the surface of the skin. So when we talk about a keratinized cell, a basal cell, it gets tough, it gets water-resistant, and it's a tough fibrous protein. So that is what the stem cell is becoming. So it's tough and it's water resistant. All right, so on to nails. So what are the purposes of nails, right? They protect the exposed dorsal superior surfaces of the tips of the fingers and the toes. The nail body is what we see and protects an area of the epidermis called the nail bed. The nail grows at the nail root, which is an epidermal fold not visible from the surface. So look at this picture here. We can see the nail root. The nail is actually growing out of the skin. That little part is called the aponychium. It's that little thing we see at the base of the nail. The nail grows at the nail root. The nail root is very close to the bone of the fingertip. Look at that. It's actually like touching the bone, kind of. That's pretty crazy. Our cuticle, or aponychium, is actually a portion of our stratum corneum of the nail root. Underlying blood vessels make nails pink. Very cool. Near the root, they are obscured, giving us the lunula, which is that light part of our skin. So you look at this picture here, the lunula, so we can't see the blood vessels under here. The aponychium or the cuticle is that part there. Pretty interesting stuff. Near the root, they are obscured, giving us the nail is a dead, surprise, tightly compressed area of cells packed with keratin. So that's keratin right there. Waterproof, still bendable. When you think of when you cut off a nail, you can fold that, but try to pull it this way. That's kind of similar to like collagen, but you can kind of think about how pliable it is, yet very, very tough. And you can think about when you scratch something, how hard and sharp your nails can be, but you can rip it right off if you're like a nail biter or something. So pretty interesting. Great example of what keratin is. And here's a, tough water resistant protein surface of the skin. Okay. After an injury, the integument is repaired in several phases. The inflammation phase, which we talked about a little bit. Bleeding occurs at the site of an injury. Those mast cells, which we learned about earlier with histamines, trigger that inflammatory response, mast cells here. There's a migration phase. So after several hours, a scab has formed. So you can see these migrating mast cells. Stratum basale are migrating along the edges of the wound. Phagocytic cells are removing debris, so they're eating, and more of these cells are arriving with the enhanced circulation in the area. Clotting around the edges of the affected area partially isolate the region. Proliferation. About a week after the injury, the scab has been undermined by epidermal cells migrating over the collagen fiber meshwork produced by fibroblasts, those fiber builders. Phagocytic activity around the site is almost ended and the fibrin clot is dissolving. So the fibrin blast, here we go, rebuilding those fibers. After several weeks, the scab has been shed and the epidermis is complete. A shallow depression marks, look at that, it's like a little valley, marks the injury site, but fibroblasts in the dermis continue to create scar tissue that will gradually elevate the overlying epidermis. That's pretty cool. Very short section. Aging on the skin includes thinning, wrinkling, and reduced melanocyte activity. And that's it. That is chapter 5. Next up, we have chapter 6, which is kind of a brief overview of bones and bone structure. So that one isn't too bad. But then we get into chapter 7, which is really our first like memorization chapter, because we're going to talk about the axial skeleton, which is basically all the bones from like our torso, abdomen upwards. That's it for now.